Helen, many thanks once again for coming to do a talk for Hertford Civic Society. Many of us here have heard earlier talks by you, and we've enjoyed them very much. For instance, on the New River, I think was probably the last one. So in a way, you don't need a lot of introduction, but I will mention to anyone who would appreciate reassurance that I've heard this very talk or something like it, because I know will do it differently every time. So the same talk, essentially, as delivered to Friends of Hertford Museum last year, and I thought it was a lovely talk with some beautiful photos, and I'm sure we're all going to enjoy this very much. So over to you. And if I can just once again remind everybody, if possible, if they know how, please make sure you're muted and that you turn off your video if possible, because that really does enhance the quality. On a stormy night, the transmission is never going to be as good. Over to you, Helen.
Jolly good. Well, good evening, everybody. Lovely to meet you all. I'm just saying before we started, anybody who missed this, normally I hand round a mini pack of Maltesers to the participants. But as I say, this is difficult to the digital age, and I've eaten the Maltesers anyway. But the point is, most people's acquaintance with malt occurs from Maltesers. The other thing I'm going to pass around at the beginning, but I'll also show it at the end, because people ask me, if you want to know about this, what you want is David Perman's The Malt Houses of Ware. As it looks as if it's going mirror image, I don't know why. Anyway, this is The Malt Houses of Ware, which is the standard book, which is obtainable from the museum in Ware, up by the Priory Gardens, and is David Perman's complete breakdown of all the ins and outs of what I'm going to say. So, David Perman, I'm grateful to for actually putting the stuff down on paper, because although I've left the file which I did on this material in the museum at what is now called Stortford South Mill Arts. Mr. Cecil Rhodes has been expunged from Bishop Stortford, and he's now called South Mill Arts. So if my material is lodged with them, so if anybody wants to poke around in there, that's where they'll find it, because I haven't actually put anything to paper. I just can't be bothered, frankly. Anyway, malt. My first acquaintance with malt, we used to say this is the house that Jack built. So this is the cock that crowed in the morn that waked the priest or shaven and shorn. But the last bit is the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. And my nursery rhyme book had a picture of this room, and in the corner of the room there was a pile of, well, it looked like sort of dog dirt, to tell you the truth. And I thought, well, that's very, very strange, because that's not what I thought malt was. In our household, malt was brown sticky stuff in a bottle, which you were given first thing in the morning to get down the cod liver oil, which was thought to be essential to life. So then I thought, well, that doesn't look remotely like the stuff in the nursery rhyme picture. However, and I didn't connect the two until I moved to Bishop Stortford. And the moment you came out of the railway station at Stortford, you were very much aware of malt, because the whole of the centre of Stortford smelt of this roasting coffee sort of smell, which I was advised was the malt. And you could tell how brown the malt was going to be by sniffing at the air as you came out of the station. And the more coffee you smelt, the darker the malt was going to be when it came out of the malting, which was adjoining the station. If you've been at Stortford Station, there's a range of maltings right by the station, right by the river there. So that was my first acquaintance with malt until in 1969, we had a celebration for the bicentenary of the opening of the Stort Navigation. And the local history society, of which at the time I was secretary or something, decided they were going to have a general festival. And we had barges and children dressed up in 18th century costume. And we borrowed a model of a malting from the Brewers Association. And we had a whole display of malting, because that was why the river was made navigable to serve the malt trade. So after that, at a future occasion, I was obliged to hand in a dissertation of something for an academic qualification. So I cobbled it all together and handed it in, and that's how it came to be organized in this fashion. So that's my acquaintance with malt. Most people are unaware, apparently, that malt is the basis of beer, and all those crates of beer that you'll see in the supermarket are all engendered from malt, and which is grown primarily in Hertfordshire anyway, the area towards Royston, which is actually called Barley, is the best area for growing barley, and which I gather is the finest barley available, which is can be turned into malt, which is then sent to the brewer to turn it into beer. Obviously, if you distill the beer further, you then get malt whiskey and various flavors and whatnot. I'm sure some of these pubs have 20 different types of whiskey, but it's all made out of malt. Anyway, this is a picture of a cornfield, which just suggests to me, this is a picture from the Fitzwilliam Museum, actually. It just suggests a cornfield from the beginning of the century, and the way that they used to stook the sheaves before they actually gathered them into the barn. So that was, I gather from Anne Padfield that this isn't barley, she said. This is wheat. So I said, well, thank you for the information. But as far as this purposes are concerned, it's barley anyway. So all around Hertfordshire, you'll see all sorts of remains of the malt trade. This is the pub in Ashwell, which the pub sign is the bushel and strike. And the bushel being the tub in which you measure cereals, including malt, and the strike is a wooden thing which you scrape across the top to make the right amount in the actual bushel. So the bushel and strike are the measurement apparatus for actually measuring barley and malt, and that was a normal way of defining how much you got. The quarter also, we had to learn a multiplication table with gills and pints and quarts and bushels and pecks and quarters, which I won't bore you with, but we had to learn it in Standard 1 with Miss Woods. Anyway, so the point is, why would you want to make malt? I'm glad this is amusing, Terry. Anyway, the point is that malt arises from the photosynthesis of the actual plant, the barley plant, which is growing to make the actual seeds in its head. So it takes hydrogen and carbon and oxygen, which I've got at the top there, which is actually combined in carbon dioxide from the air, water from the ground, and the carbon dioxide and the water combine in little groups of 6. So you get 6 black carbon atoms sitting around in a circle, and each one is allied to an O and an H, or 2 H's and an O, and the 6 altogether make the molecule of glucose. Frequently, with a plant, will actually, in order to concentrate the actual goodness of the material, will actually link the molecules into pairs, which makes sucrose, which is the ordinary sugar you get in your tea, and fructose and lactose. And it also will multiply numerous times to make starch, which is in fact a sort of multiple molecule consisting of these units of glucose all crammed together. So what does the actual process of breaking down the malts, when you've got the malts, you want to use it to make the alcohol. So there is the glucose molecule in the middle, and the clever trick that yeast does is to break it up then into 3 units, so that there are 2 carbon atoms in each unit, and the molecule on the right-hand side is ethyl alcohol with 2 carbon atoms and the hydrogen and oxygen around it. And if you do the addition that is left, which I've done there, you will see that you get a bit of carbon, 2 molecules of carbon dioxide left over, and that's why it fizzes. So if you're making beer at home with one of those kits, you have to put a valve on the top to let the carbon dioxide out, which will bubble away while the actual alcohol forms. So the sugar is converted to alcohol using the yeast, and the carbon dioxide is a byproduct of that. which is why distillers are the main sellers of carbon dioxide for all sorts of purposes, blowing up balloons and all manner. And you see lorries of these stuff going around in cylinders. Anyway, the point is that what the maltster is busy doing is taking the barley molecule, barley seeds, which are on the right in this picture, and wetting them so that they can start to grow. And you wet them and leave it for a couple of days, and gradually out of one end comes a little root, and out of the other end comes a little shoot. And if you leave this without, normally if I'm doing this with kids or whatnot, I actually get it growing and take it. They can all see the actual little roots growing out. So you'll have to imagine it. Anyway, the point is that the plant is trying to convert the starch, which is in the seed, into glucose so that it can grow and produce the green shoots above it. And if you leave the actual thing growing, that's what you'll get, a load of green growth. But the maltster doesn't want that. He wants the sugar to be formed by the conversion of the starch within the seed into glucose, and so that that can then be acted upon by the yeast to produce the alcohol. So his business is to start it growing and then stop it, because if you left it growing, it would end up with green stuff, and that's not what he wants. So the stuff on the left-hand side is malt at the point at which you stop it growing. The seeds have actually produced a root and a shoot, and your business now is to stop it and dry it, and then you can send it to the brewer and he can use it to make the beer. So the process is, in actual fact, germinating the barley and then stopping it germinating at the right point at which the sugar conversion is at its maximum. So what you'll see all over Hertfordshire and various other places as well, but we're talking about Hertfordshire in a minute, are these malt houses. And people like to have houses called the Maltings or the Malt House. It's all very folky and whatnot. But very few people nowadays know actually what was going on inside them. But when I first came to Stortford, which was in about 1960, the great industry of this part of Hertford, Ware and Stortford, was making malt. And it was the main economic lifeblood of the whole district. And these malt houses were very, very common. They've now mostly been converted to other purposes, but they're quite difficult because the actual height of each floor is not really high enough to live in, to convert into flats or whatever. Anyway, what we're seeing here, number one, you can see the barley is coming into the actual malting and being dropped into a tank, dropped from number 3 down below into a tank at the bottom, which is filled with water, and is there left to soak to get the actual germination going. Then the chap has to shovel it all out onto the floor, and the malting will characteristically have at least one floor, possibly 4 or 5 on top of each other. But the malt is laid across the floor and then is shoveled along the floor as it grows, and it grows its little shoot and its little root, and is shoveled along the floor till it gets to the far end. By the time it gets to 9 and 10 at the far end of the actual diagram, it's ready to be stopped growing. So it is then transferred to the actual floor of the kiln, which is number 13, and it is laid out there and heated from below using various fuels, which we'll talk about later. But it is heated and in many cases actually roasted to make it brown, depending on the colour of beer that you're actually aiming to produce. And the steam and smoke to a certain extent, and certainly the smell of the roasting malt emits out of the top. And there are various local forms of cowls, which you will see. This particular one, I think, is the one in Ware, or Southern Maltings in Ware, which is by Gibbs Lane car park. Anyway, that's the characteristic form of a malting. These are sketches which were done by Leslie Stew in Stortford before, when these buildings were not converted to other uses. And this is the middle-aged one. You can see the input at the left-hand side. The tank for this was just by the door there. And there are 3 floors here. The malt proceeds along the floor till it gets to the other end where the kiln is, where it's dried and roasted, and then it drops out into the below, and is then taken. This is the river end, the far end, and then it is transmitted characteristically by barge down to London to Truman's and Courage's and Fuller's and all the rest of the brewers in London, because that is the main access for this part of the world. The fact that you could get your stuff by barge from Hertford, Ware and Stortford with minimum expense right down to London. So these are various forms of cowl which were patented, and you'll see several in Stortford. Cooper's shop by the river at the bottom has one of these, and the ones in Ware at Southern Maltings, as I said, have these very fancy ends on. The height of the trade, this is the big one by the station in Stortford, and as you can see has 4 floors and 2 enormous kilns on the end, and was in fact built in 1895. We'll see the date on it in a minute. That is the sort of the zenith of the floor malting trade in Hertfordshire, because after that they ceased to actually lay the malt down on the floor and thought that there were better ways of doing it, as they've been doing on the continent for many, many years. So that's the big one in Stortford. Anyway, once the malt, I didn't take any pictures of the malt actually in the steep. I wasn't thinking that any of these pictures would end up as sort of archival material. So I didn't actually take any pictures of it. But once it's all wetted, it then has to be transported onto the floor, and it's very heavy and wet. And they have these special barrows lined with galvanized zinc, which they can shovel along the floor and lay it out on the floor, ready to actually start growing. So at this point, the malt is soaking wet, and the amount of water in it is obviously the expertise of the maltster to know exactly how much wet to let in and how long to keep it on the floor. When it's laid out on the floor, I say these pictures are rather, I didn't really, as I say, think that they were going to be shown to people in 50 years' time. So they're rather vague in lots of ways, and they're copied from slides, of course. But this is the actual malt on the floor in Stortford at the big malting, which belonged to H.A.&D Taylor Maltings at Stortford. While the malt is on the floor, unless you do rake it around and stir it around a bit, it will all mat together, and the little roots will all stick together, and it'll just form a complete mat of growing little seeds. So what you have to do is to rake it around with a special rake, and this chap has to buzz up and down the rows and stir it all around while it's growing, so it doesn't all get matted up. But you can see how low the actual floors are. They're just high enough for the workers to actually walk in there and not hit their heads on the ceiling. But they're not really high enough for any other purpose apart from actually malting, which is difficult. Also, you'll notice that they are very heavy. There are numerous iron stanchions to hold up the actual floor above, because in this case, there are 4 floors on top of each other, and they're all held apart by these iron stanchions, and the actual floor underneath the malt is waterproof. In this case, it was Welsh slates laid completely on the floor. Sometimes they are red quarry tiles, and very old ones actually have old plaster of Paris laid, but most of the 19th century ones are, in fact, quarry tiles or Welsh slate. But they're very heavy, and the actual malting has a lot of these pillars to hold the thing together. But because they're very substantial buildings, of course, they did in fact last right up to the 1970s. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with seeing the outside of them, even if we never got inside. Anyway, here's the malt growing away, having been raked into nice rows. And this is the middle malting, I think. It's one of the rather lesser complicated ones. It so happened that my interest in this, as I say, had been aroused by the bicentenary of the opening of the Stort, which was in 1969. And it so happened that shortly after that, we were advised that there was a building in Dunmow, right behind the co-op it is. If you park behind the co-op and then walk behind, you will see this building. And at the time, it was being used by the Boy Scouts as a sort of a hut to have their meetings in. But it was more or less a semi-derelict malting, which we could see was a malting. It's got a kiln at the end. And we were able to poke around inside and see what was in fact an old malting, probably originally built about 1500. It's been modified since, but the actual structure inside was in fact completely timber framed and plastered on the outside, and dates probably from about 1500. So the next series of slides are of this particular building. So if you go inside, you can actually see the timber framing of it. The kiln part was in fact brick, because obviously you're going to have heating. You don't want to have it set out on fire. But the whole thing was constructed of very substantial timbers, which coincide with the sequence of joints which Adrian had postulated for timber frame buildings in Hertfordshire and Essex. So that's the inside. This is in fact the hole which you could get the malt from the tank which was down below it. There's a little hook on the wall there, and you open this flap up and hook it back with the little hook, and then you can gain access to the tank which is underneath there, which is where the malt was wetted. And you can actually see there the structure of the actual timber framing of the walls with the braces at the side, which if you're interested in those sort of things, is quite interesting. Now, this is the outside of the kiln, which you can see the sort of fan shape of the lining of the kiln, which is entirely timber and plastered. And you can see now the actual roofing of the floor, which is coming towards you, which has a sort of crown post arrangement, but it's all timber frame. That's the point. The actual interior of the kiln is entirely plastered, and you can see up the whole of it. And why it hadn't got burned down, which a lot of kilns does happen, because they're very hot and the smoke and the steam go out. Fires at maltings were very common. So you're here now inside the kiln. That is the floor on which the malt was ready to be dried was laid, and you had access to it through a door, because you had to be able to get in and out to put it in and take it out again. And the actual floor in this case was a wire mesh, which you can see sort of going up the wall on the left-hand side. It had all rusted away a long time ago, but the wire mesh was a particular industry of where they actually wove this stuff, particularly for malt kilns. The actual mesh was supported on a layer of brick supports, which are particularly shaped to fit together and form a sort of a floor in between, so that would support the wire. And if you go underneath that, which we'll do in a minute, that was supported underneath. That's the actual door into the kiln. You can see the actual chimney in the white part at the top, which is the actual cone shape. And you can see the floor of the bricks and the wire mesh, which is all rusted away, which sort of lapped up the sides. If you go underneath, there are the bricks at the top, which were sort of long ones, specially made to fit together. And they were supported on it was like a cathedral under there, because the heat had to be allowed to transmit itself from the actual furnace, which is down below, through the bricks and into the floor of the kiln. This is the actual fire end. The kiln door is at the top there, and there are various controllers which they can control the actual draft on the actual fire. But the fire was in that hole, and the heat passed up through the actual bricks that we've just looked at and dried out the malt. That's the underneath of it. You can see it's sagging somewhat, but the actual heat passed up through this various brick arrangements underneath, through the actual iron of the actual floor. That's looking out the door. You can see the door with the hole. It was very essential to have a cat and a hole to let the cat in and out, and a ladder to go up, to go into the upper part of the kiln, because you needed to rake it around while it was actually drying and roasting, and to stop it when it had got to the right state and the right brownness that you needed for whatever you were going to brew. But the fire went in at the left-hand side at the bottom, and you whizzed up and down the stairs to control the actual roasting of the malt. But it was very interesting to see in a rather a derelict form what was a typical small malting of the district from about 1500, which had been kept going, I think, probably up to the 1940s, probably up to the Second World War. Anyway, this picture was taken by me at the maltings at Sawbridgeworth, the HA&D Taylor's maltings by the level crossing at Sawbridgeworth. And this was taken in 1969, and it was before that any regulations about health and germs and God knows what in food had in fact been thought of, I think, because this was how your malt was made in 1969 among the cobwebs and all the rest of it. And this picture, you can see the chap with the ladder which went up to the top to take the samples. He's got the fire going, and this stuff on the left-hand side is the faggots of hornbeam, which was typically used at Sawbridgeworth to actually make the specific flavour of malt, which was very famous. The Hertfordshire brown malt was characteristically roasted on hornbeam faggots, which were burned in a sort of bonfire in the hole down there, where you can see, and this chap had to keep it stoked, and the heat went through, and you can see the actual round kiln in this case, and you can see the iron band which goes round to hold the thing together, and the little tension brackets to hold the thing across where the floor of the malt kiln was suspended, and actually the heat passed through. So typically on a kiln, some are round, some are square, but they've all got a lot of support to keep them in one piece, with iron brackets going around them, and a hole at the bottom for the fire, and access to the top to get in and out. This is the actual sideways look of it. That was the actual fire that was actually burning. Well, I didn't realize at the time that it was a historic sight to see, but I suppose it is now. And there's a ladder which is well worn by them having to whiz up and down, and the bowls at the top, they had to take a sample and whiz it then out to the lab, which was across the yard. And there, the people in there said, yes, that's brown enough, stop it, and stop the fire, and we'll unload it, and that's brown enough, depending on the browns, of course, that they wanted. But I mean, for Guinness and whatnot, you need very, very dark brown, whereas for the Hertfordshire brown malt, if you were at one of my meetings, I would show you some in the bottle, but it's a sort of a middle brown colour. But the Guinness is made from a very, very enormous black stuff. Well, that's the same again. It is all at Sawbridgeworth. There's the steps and the fire and what have you. Anyway, what was controlling the malt industry during the whole of its time that we are interested in it? Well, from the 1660s right up to the 1880s was the fact that it was the main source of tax. There wasn't income tax, and there wasn't capital gains and inheritance tax. The main tax that was paid by most people was a malt tax, and the malt was assessed every day. The man came to your malting and measured how much was going through, and he had a measure, we'll see in a minute, and he then taxed you on the amount that malt was going through. And depending on the state of the national debt, the malt tax was increased or decreased, mostly increased, and people became very aggravated by the actual rates that they had to pay. And plenty of people, if you want to know about this, there's Peter Mathias has a book about malt, and he's got all the figures of the actual rates of malt of tax that were actually agreed on right the way through from the 1680s up to the 1880s, and it was very, very heavy. And people like I'm trying to think of the man's name, not Cobbold, Cobbett, had a campaign. If you read his book, Village Economy, he was trying to persuade people that by having beer and paying the malt tax was an absolute swindle, and that ordinary good Englishmen should be able to drink their beer without having to pay such extortionate tax, and not have to be obliged to drink tea, which he thought was an absolute outrage, that people should pay ridiculous prices, with also had tax on for stuff which are bought from China and India and goodness knows what. So he was actually trying to make people realize that the malt tax was a bad thing. But people will tell you that the Napoleonic Wars and Nelson's navy were paid for out of tax on malt, which was drunk by every man and woman in the country, and actually levied at the time when the malt was actually growing in the maltings, rather than as it is today on the actual liquid beer when it's actually been actually made. So the malt tax was very important, and I got this notice from a chap who I met through Adrian's evening class, who had been an officer, and this is actually standing on his piano. That's why it looks rather strange. When he retired, he took the notice off the door and various bits of equipment that he had. Well, he didn't actually use it, but his predecessors had, in order to visit the maltings. See, it went every day, 10 to 11, and they turned up. And there was an awful lot of aggro. And there are very famous stories which David Perman will tell you about. They had a new hounded out of the town by angry maltsters who thought he was diddling them, or at least realizing the various fiddles which they had got organized to avoid paying the maximum tax. Anyway, the tax was very important as a national income. And the the customs and excise man had all sorts of equipment, which this is part of. This is a hygrometer for measuring the actual specific gravity of a liquid. And he also had this pouch with the Royal Arms embossed on it, and various measures, because he had to measure how deep the malt was in the steep, and what the size was, the width and the depth of the actual malting. And then he had to do a sum using a slide rule, which you can see at the bottom. So that was the job of an excise officer at the time. And the problem was that the actual process of making the malt was controlled by the excise, and you were not allowed to just do what you fancied. You had to wet it and have it measured at the agreed method, and you were not allowed to divert from the actual way of doing it. It wasn't until 1880, but the malt tax was abolished, and then England could join the rest of the continent on not having floor maltings, but having great big things that looked like washing machines, which the malt sort of was whizzed around, and that was called pneumatic malting. But it was actually forbidden in England until the malt tax was repealed. So there were two great barriers, and the other one was the transport. And you can see this is a typical 18th century arrangement, and they've got, I think it's 8 or 6 horses to pull one wagon. And sorry, folks. Let's get rid of that. Anyway, the point is you had to have a great suite of horses in order to pull one coach. So Mr. Duckett, this is Mr. Duckett, Sir George Duckett, who had the notion of making the Stort navigable up to Bishop Stortford, because you could already get up to Hertford and Ware down the Lee, but as the Lee forks at Rye House and the Stort goes off, the Stort goes off towards Stortford, and he had the notion that if they could make it navigable, then the trade in Bishop Stortford would be completely revolutionized, which it was. So he envisaged the Stort. This is a picture by Constable, but it gives a picture of what a navigable river at that time would have looked like. So you've got one horse pulling, in this case, 2 barges, and he's fixed by one rope, seems to be, and the lock at the top, which is like the one at South Mill in Stortford, or the ones at Ware and Hertford, which we've all seen. But that is the sort of the picture that you have to get in your mind, that instead of having 6 horses trying to pull one wagon, you could have one horse pulling 2 great barges, which was incredibly more efficient. And that is why the navigation of the Stort completely revolutionized Stortford and other towns once you could get it organised, you could get to London at a very minimal cost. I just put that in to give us a picture of the one horse, because people realise that once you've got the thing floating on the water, one horse can pull an enormous amount of freight behind itself. And of course, only needs to eat one lot of food, whereas 6 horses eat a lot more. Anyway, Mr. Duckett had the Stort made navigable. This is the centre of Stortford, as it is, well, it was until very recently. And he made a sort of turning round area of the river so that you could turn the barges round. And it's right underneath where you go to Cooper's hardware store. The castle you can see on the top of the picture, and you can see the Corn Exchange is the black building in the middle, which was built in connection with this trade. And you can see the church on the hill, just below the Wordwind Hill. So Stortford was, in fact, a medieval town with its North Street and the actual plots going off either side, the burgage plots with the castle. And it was then, once the river had been made navigable, was completely revolutionised in terms of the malt industry. So what we saw then, that is what this is the actual first edition of the Ordnance Survey, showing the actual turning circle of the river, and the house just above the turning circle was a house which was, when I first moved to Stortford, that was the council offices, but it was actually Mr. Duckett's own house, and the various branches of the river, so that the Maltings could actually have access straight to the river and put their malt on a barge, and it could be down to London at minimum cost. Anyway, we see the bottom half. This is the lower half, which all these maltings have in fact gone, apart from the 2 at the very bottom, which were the ones we first saw the pictures of, the sketches done by Leslie Stew. And this shows the 2 maltings which were there in 1880, which this map was made, and the 1897 one was actually put in the middle. That was the very big one that we saw in the middle, but it was no longer there. Well, it hasn't get there in 1880. But you can see how these things actually fronted right onto the river so that they could load straight into barges. So these are the ones at South Mill. This was the 1845 one, which has its date on it and various sorts of roof. And this has got 3 floors. And you can see that's characteristic. That's the date on it, 1843. JM is Joshua Miller, who was the maltster who had it built. And I've actually managed to pick up him and his relations on the baptismal registers in St. Michael's. And he had all his children's names actually carved into the actual side. So here we see at the bottom GM, which was George Miller. And if you go along there, you can find all the children's names in the actual brickwork of the malting. That is the 1843 one. The one in the middle, the 1897 one, has a very nice Art Nouveau type of waterhead with the date very conveniently put on it. And that is much, much bigger and was more or less, at that point, they hadn't yet realised that they could then go over to the continental pneumatic malting, wouldn't need their floor maltings anymore, because most of the continental buildings had gone over to that method years before. This is the Cooper's shop, which you can go inside. And if you go inside and go through the flower department, and if you go where they used to have lampshades, I think they've moved it around, you can go inside the inside of these hills and see how they operated from the inside. So that was right on the river, and which used to flow where the plants are now, is now culverted underneath there and comes out the other side of the level crossing. Anyway, in order to facilitate the trade in Stortford, they decided to build a corn exchange. And this is how it was when I first moved there. You can tell by the age of the cars that it is about 1960. Well, 1969 was the time I got interested in this. And the idea was that the corn exchange consisted of a large building with the glass roof was put on secondary to its being built in 1828. But it had also a big ballroom, which is the part under the clock, which they held balls like you would have had Mr. Darcy and Jane Austen cavorting themselves around in 1828. And it was made as a social centre and as well as a corn exchange and banking facility for the town. And it was the main. When we first had it, it was occupied by a conservative club, and it was full of pigeon droppings and cigarette ends and other tasteable things. And we did, in fact, hope to have it converted to make a museum of the town, like the one in St Albans, because it occupies in the town in the same position as the big white building at the end of St Peter Street in St Albans, which has just recently been converted to a museum. And I do urge you to go in there and have a cup of tea and sit in the dock, because it was actually the court where people had to go and be tried. And you can sit in the prisoner's dock, or the Stortford, which is exactly the same date, and was in a pretty sleazy sort of way in 69. This is a picture of the interior of the Ipswich Corn Exchange, which shows you how busy they were and what a hard-working job it is to buy and sell corn. But these people used to meet in Stortford on a Thursday, which was market day, and you had your own stall with your name on the front, and you stood by it, and you met your customers, and you sold or bought and sold malt and fertilizer and all sorts of agricultural necessities. And then you could go down to North Street and patronize the pubs, and then gradually make yourself home on a Thursday. This is Ipswich, but it is exactly the same as it must have been at Stortford. And some of these desks, when they actually emptied the corn exchange out, we corrected several of them, and they are in the museum at what is now called the South Mill Arts Centre with the name. And we did, in fact, make a note of the people's names on them, which gives you a record of the sort of span of customers that the actual corn exchange had. That's what it looks like now. Well, actually, since now we've had some umbrellas put on the top to make it a bit more festive. But what they did, the county council wanted to pull it down. That was the whole point, and make some public lavatories. And it was the start really of the Hertford Civic Society. We had a big campaign to stop them doing that. And those of you who know Russ Craig will know that Russ was on the side of the county council trying to pull it down, and I was on the other side trying to make it stay. And poor old Russ had to, we met for lots of, but fortunately he lost his case and we won it. But they did in fact take off about 4 feet of the front side of the corn exchange, revealing the actual stanchions of the interior and make the road about 6 feet wider. But it's at least it's standing there. But the ballroom at the top, which was very fine, when we'd taken the pigeon droppings out of it anyway, and could have been a very nice assembly room come museum room, which they've got in St Albans. They've actually made that into a beautiful ballroom, which you can hire for any venue that you might, but it might have been like that at Stortford. However, it is still standing there, and it's converted into offices with a forefoot through the middle, but it's there. Anyway, this next series is about the pictures that I took. You can see from the child there, which is my son, who is now 50 odd, and he was then about 6. And this is Bishop Stortford. This is Sawbridgeworth. The kiln that we saw previously is the one on the left-hand side, where you can see the actual doors going in and out. But Mr. Chappell, who was the manager down there, was very kind and showed me around and told me all the ins and outs about, which was very, very kind of him. So that is the lab, the black building, where they actually took the samples in to make sure that it was the right amount of blackness. And the river you can see on the left. It is now converted to all sorts of bathroom showrooms and all manner of commercial outlets are in there now. But it does still survive. But it's impossible to make most of it into residential accommodation because they're too low. Anyway, these are the heaps of hornbeam faggots which were alongside the river, and I think mainly came, so I understand, from Broxbourne Woods, where the hornbeam is very common and is grown particularly for this purpose. And the actual flavour that it's supposed to impart is a particular speciality of this Hertfordshire brown malt. Other people will say they couldn't think anything else to do with this hornbeam because it doesn't make anything else. It can be burnt, but it doesn't make any use as timber otherwise. And it's a way of getting rid of it and making a bit of cash selling it for this particular purpose. Anyway, there were big piles of it, which, as I say, are now sort of period pieces, I suppose. Anyway, now we're going to where? This is the Gibbs Lane car park. I'm sure you've been in there when you were going to Place House. This is now being converted into a sort of a museum of malting. And the committee down there are being very active and organising it, that you can have keep fit classes and ballet classes and pints of beer and all manner of things. So it is in the process at the moment of being converted to a social use, which will benefit people of Ware. These are the fancy, they're very, very ornamental, the actual cowls on this particular one. But you can see the stanchions at the bottom holding the kiln together and the actual kiln on the top. So they are very, I like the ones with heart-shaped fans on, because obviously they will rotate, the wind will push it round and actually enable the steam and the smoke to get out at the top. This series that I've got right here now are a series of postcards which I've stuck in this talk, because a lot of, I remember in my childhood, this is how it was. We used to, during the war, I suppose they couldn't get petrol, but the farmer opposite us had two horses, Prince and Dolly, and he did exactly this. And people weren't so sort of risk averse, and safety wasn't so. We were allowed to go and hold the horse and stroke it and ride on the wagon and all the rest of it. So I've stuck these in just to remind people of what in my lifetime has been completely revolutionised, of course. But it was the case that up to 1950, anyway, up to the end of the war, this was how the harvest was taken in. So this is the actual reaper with two horses on. There were a set of postcards which I found in a junk shop, in actual fact, but I thought they were quite meaningful. Homeward creeps the loaded wain. So they're sort of a bit folky, but they are genuine photographs, obviously, of the situation. And with the horses, two horses to pull one wagon, of course. Two horses again, pulling a reaper and a reaper binder, which actually cut the corn, and with the one that you can see on the right hand side here, with the sort of windmill at the back, tied the sheaves up with bale of twine into sheaves, which were then stacked up to dry. But here we've got four horses doing two separate operations, one actually cutting the stuff and the other binding it. Anne Padfield has been very helpful and helped me to understand what goes on here, because she understands these marvellous. Anyway, this is a painting by Stubbs. It always amazes me that these dear ladies are so beautifully dressed. I'm not sure whether if they weren't being painted by Mr. Stubbs, they would have been quite so elegant. But it gives you the picture of an 18th century harvesting scene with the horses the same, and the cart and the people piling it up. Of course, once that we got into I've just been watching, I don't know if you have, a series of films by Fred Dibner, about the evolution of the steam engine. And he goes right through from Trevithick right through into the actual proper railways. But this is a steam engine which probably would date from about 1820 or so, and being used for thrashing here. But they did, in fact, take over from the horses, of course. And if you've seen that film, not the most recent one, but the one before, Far from the Madding Crowd, the one with Julie Christie in, there's a very good scene of them actually having the steam engine, and the neighbouring farmer gets the steam engine. Of course, the more backward-looking people think it's all modern, dreadful things that are going to get rid of jobs on farms. And as you can see from the number of people they're actually employing, it's quite a lot of people. Whereas nowadays, you'd have one man in a combine and doing the whole job. This is the threshing machine at We've got this down at Cressy Temple. It was given to us by the Lyons, by Toby Lyons' family. And they did, in fact, have it last going at Hazel End in 1987 with a steam engine actually making it go. The actual machine, they've kind of given us to have it down at Cressy, and it's preserved down there. I think I've got that's it here. So that was a threshing machine for use with a steam engine. And you would use the barley to thresh the barley, and then you'd have if you were going to malt it, you could then take it to the malting. Here's the last crew. It says the last thrashing crew at Cressy Temple. And you can see there you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11 chaps all employed at Cressy Temple on that job. Ransom, as you can see the name on the actual machine behind them. We've also got some, I've just put these in for sake of these are beautiful. These wagons are handmade, beautiful, painted different colours for the counties, are actually works of art, and they're absolutely beautiful to look at. So the floor malting went out of use after 1880. It took some time to go out of use, but these are the pneumatic maltings which took over from they have them on the floor. So you put the malt in one of these things and it rotates and stirs it all around just like a washing machine, and you don't have to have it on the floor anymore. Now, my main source here has been Guy Horlock down at Stansted Abbots, because he apparently bought some of these machines when they were being got rid of from Sawbridgeworth and installed them at Stansted Abbots. And in fact, they are still going strong. And in fact, it has resurrected itself. In fact, I've got here the guidebook, which I think I've got it here, of French and Jups at Stansted Abbots. And they are now the only place in Hertfordshire where they are actually making malt in the old way. Well, it's not the old way because they're making it in these pneumatic maltings, but they are actually making malt because the rise of these folky sort of breweries has made the market for these specialist malts much more active than it was perhaps 10 years ago. And in fact, they're now selling in masses of it. I gather from Guy to America. They're sending a container load of Hertfordshire malt over to America to make folky real ale over in America. So that is what you'll see now instead of a floor malting. And instead of a kiln, you'll see a sort of glorious roasting thing. You put the malt in there and stir it all around, heat it up till it's brownness, and then you can sell it to whoever wants to make their real ale and what have you. And French and Jups have actually cornered the market in this particular area, having gone through a patch of virtually complete dereliction when most of the maltings in Hertfordshire shut down. Anyway, I've got a series here now of the big maltings. This is the one in Ware, the Victoria maltings. Obviously, they were very fine buildings. This one's got 4 or 5 floors. This one was actually destroyed by fire and was later demolished. That's in the middle of Ware. There are now flats on that site. And in order to replace it, they built, in fact, a German, what's called a Vanderhofen. It's a German way of making malt, which is a sort of a halfway house to the pneumatic malting. This was actually active in Ware for about 15 years, I think. But at the time it was built, it was the very latest thing in malting. And it could be run by one man. You had to deliver the barley at one end and it came out at the other, and one man, it could run itself, in fact, for 24 hours. If you went inside, there is the malt in great big trays, in fact, growing away, wet and all steamy, very humid inside there. And in order to stir it all around, instead of having a man walking around with a rake, this arrangement sort of went on a railway up and down the actual trough of malt while it was growing to keep it stirred around. And then when it got to the other end, it was kilned, and the whole thing was controlled electronically and could be done by one chap, I understand. Unfortunately, the competition from the circular pneumatic maltings proved to be too much. And apart from French and Jups, who are actually carrying on doing it, this in fact ceased to be. I haven't got an actual date for this. I think it must have been about 1980. but it did in fact close down. That was the actual stuff going at the end, Hall's malt in bags. However, the people ask me, where has it gone? Well, it's gone mainly down to Bury St Edmunds, where there is an enormous malt factory run by Associated British Maltsters, which was a combine which was made up of places like HA and Detailers at Sawbridgeworth. They were all amalgamated into Associated British Maltsters and then took off down to Bury St Edmunds. And there are enormous maltings down at Mistley by the river where the boats come in from the Ukraine, funnily enough. Large sources of barley are in the Ukraine and Poland and whatnot, where they grow this stuff very cheaply, and it's bought by boat and is actually malted on the quayside at Mistley, where there are enormous maltings owned by various companies, including Carlsberg and a firm called Ed May and various of them. Anyway, the point is the local ones, while you were trying to get the malt hot, you would burn a lot of fuel, and whereas timber and the hornbeam faggots were all very folky, most of the malting was in fact burnt on actual coal, which was brought up the rivers by the barges which took the malt down to London. So the coal came up, and firms like Charrington's, which you'll notice also had a brewing enterprise in London, also sold fuel. And this one is at Widford, right by the railway, where you go in a double bend over the railway. And the coal was bought there and used in the malting industry. And to this day, you can go and get your coal from there. But the trade, Mr. Joshua Miller at Stortford had the dual trade of selling coal locally and also malting and moving malt around. Also, the other trade that has followed on from the expertise that the malters had is actually manufacturing pharmaceuticals. This is the Ware factory of Glaxo. Well, it's now GlaxoSmithKline, isn't it? But it was Allen and Hanbury's, and its ancestry, if you look at it from that way, is in the process of malting, because the Hanburys were big maltsters and became pharmaceutical manufacturers. I don't know if any of you remember Sir John, who was a very great supporter of the East Arts Archaeological Society. And he was the last, I think there were 5 generations of qualified chemists who controlled Hanbury's enterprise of making pharmaceuticals in Ware. They also made a lot of hospital equipment. If you go into Liverpool Street Station, there's a big chimney on the north side of the track, and it says Allen and Hanbury's on it, still in tiles all the way up the chimney, because they made a lot of hospital equipment and lancets and God knows what, which all span off from their malting expertise into medical equipment. And if you look at this, this is their wagon, which was apparently a steam wagon. I can't remember where I got this picture from, but I thought it was very, very meaningful because it's a steam wagon with Allenbury's on, Allen and Hanbury's, London and Ware, ready to take your malt. I gather my mother said that she weaned me on Allenbury's diet, which was thought it was a baby food, which included barley and malt and was thought to be very nutritious for infants and invalids and anybody else, and was marketed widely. They also made blackcurrant pastils, which are supposed to make your throat better. But Allen and Hanbury's had well, they still do. They are now part of GlaxoSmithKline, but they were one of the main pharmaceutical manufacturers. And they will tell you that in the course of the Second World War, they were the first firm to actually manufacture penicillin on an industrial scale when it had been discovered in London at St Mary's Hospital. We all know the story, but it was manufactured in bulk by Allen and Hanbury's in Ware. So at that happy point, I think I've ceased my talk.
Just remains to say that I know we've all hugely enjoyed this event, which has made us see a lot of things differently. And it's been an enormous pleasure. So thank you so much, Helen.
Tiny my pleasure.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jolly good.